I wanted to put out a video. I just came up with a title the other day, like "Not Your Grandpa's Heat Pump" or something, because people people have this
Right,
concept of like,
right,
and they're thinking of maybe a single stage heat pump, right? Like from the 90s.
right.
It's funny because that's the most common myth, definitely, that people hear when they think of heat pumps is that they don't work in cold weather. But we have heat pumps that work down into -10.
Okay, hi, and welcome to the Engineers HVAC podcast. I'm your host today, and we thank you so much for joining us. Our tagline here is to empower and educate the HVAC community. So I'm excited for our next guest because we're going to talk about something that's really a hot, quote unquote, hot topic right now in the HVAC world, and that's heat pumps, and specifically heat pumps in cold climates. So Howard Bynder is our guest today. How are you, Howard?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Tony. Awesome to be on the show.
Awesome. We thank you so much for joining us. And Howard is the owner and creator of the Bee Heating and AC HVAC company in Denver, Colorado, and also the host of the HVAC Dope Show, which is a fantastic YouTube channel, which we'll talk about here near the end. So I'm so glad you reached out to me. It's so funny. We've been doing a lot of stuff on heat pumps here, and we're located in the Southeast, so a little different climate than you have in Denver, Colorado. And I was thinking, man, I'd really like to get a guest on the show who could talk about cold weather heat pumps. And then Howard reached out to me out of the blue, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. So come on the show, let's talk about it. So we're going to talk about that, and wherever the conversation goes, we'll see. It's going to be all about heat pumps. So how's that sound, Howard?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. I'm excited to be here, and yeah, it is definitely a hot topic. So that's it sounds like law of attraction. There, you manifested the cold weather heat pump podcast.
That's right. I'd like to manifest, a couple $1 million in my bank account, but that doesn't seem to work when I try that. So I'll
Hey, you
I'll
never
stick with
know.
the I'll stick with the heat pump guess. So no,
Right
man,
on.
thank you. It's the internet's a great thing today. We get to collaborate with people we've never met before, and Howard and I just met a few minutes ago before on the pre-call. So it's really cool, and we really do love giving back to the HVAC community and hearing from people around the country. Like I said before, I've generally had my career in the Southeast, and heat pumps are in our blood. I mean, we've used them. We don't even think about it. Like we use heat pumps all the time. And, with the whole electrification and decarbonization movement, going on, heat pumps are getting a ton of attention. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about heat pumps, a lot of things that I'm like, that's not really my experience. And so I thought we'd talk about a few of those. And one of the myths, we hear all the time is they don't operate in cold climates. What is so here, I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. If we're lucky, maybe once a year we get in the single digits. So we don't have what I would call an extremely cold climate. When I was in Florida, we had no cold climate.
Yeah.
It operate a few times a year. Your fireplace you might use that twice in a decade, something like that. So what's your experience there with cold weather heat pumps?
Yeah, no, it's funny because that's the most common myth, definitely, that people hear when they think of heat pumps is that they don't work in cold weather. But we have heat pumps that work down into -10. We technically have in Fahrenheit. We technically have a pretty moderate climate. Like Colorado is definitely we have I think as many days of sunshine as Phoenix, Arizona. So it's a very sunny state, but we
Mhm.
still get and it might not be quite as many as Phoenix, but I know it's like one of the sunniest states. And so in the winter, it's notorious for, hey, it could be 60 one day, and then the next day it could be a blizzard and be -10 for a couple days. But for the most part, if you look at like historical lows, like in Denver, lows in the coldest month are 20, highs are 40. But we have like this coming weekend, we have a bunch of single digit temps rolling in and a cold snap, and it'll be sub-zero a few days next week, according to the 10-day. But that's
Mhm.
Colorado. The weather changes pretty quick because of the Rocky Mountains. And so, what we run into a lot, like we put in a lot of different types of heat pumps. And most of when you hear, that thought of, oh, heat pumps don't work in cold weather, that might have been I wanted to put out a video. I just came up with a title the other day, like "Not Your Grandpa's Heat Pump" or something, because people people have this
Right,
concept of like,
right,
and they're thinking of maybe a single stage heat pump, right? Like from the 90s
right, right.
that doesn't heat up. And one of the things we always look at is there's multiple types of heat pumps, right? Because people just think of like your
Mm,
standard air source heat pump. That's most of what we install. But what we're actually You know, you have geothermal heat pumps. Those work in all, you know, climate
Mm-hmm.
temperatures in terms of like your outdoor temps, just because it takes a while before the ground is very stable in terms of its temperature. And so you have a loop that you're pulling heat
Right.
from, and the COP on those stays pretty stable regardless of
All year
outside,
round.
yeah, year round, regardless of outside air temperature. So there's a lot of products out there. You know, there's air to water products that are coming out this year that are, and I think part of it is because a lot of the stuff has been bigger in Europe or other places, because a lot of it comes down to like the cost equation versus, you know, a basic furnace or a boiler, and the cost to use the equipment versus the cost for the
Mm-hmm.
newer high efficiency equipment. But it's starting to, because there's rebates that are incentivizing people, and a lot of people are going solar. They're looking at, when you look at some of the air to water products that, like I said, they've been out probably 10, 20 years, you know, overseas and big in Europe, are coming to North America. They can replace not only your, you know, central forced air system, they can also do radiant in-floor heating, because they can heat
Mm.
a radiant floor system to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And on some of the refrigerants, especially when you get into stuff like R290, which we don't have here yet, but well, we do have it, but just because of the charge limitations, you don't see it on residential systems. And so, but that's something that would put us in a position where we can get higher water temps. So then it can do even like a traditional boiler baseboard. You can do forced air hydronics with these systems. And so and then at a minimum, all the systems that are coming out, you know, in the next, you know, 6 months that we're excited to
Mm-hmm.
install, can do your domestic hot water too. And so when you pair that with someone who's on solar in a sunny state, and they can heat their house, they can cool their house, all with the same appliance, and they can get hot water from it, and they can be off the grid and get rid of their, you know, electrical bill, it starts to make a lot of, you know, financial sense. And especially if it keeps up 99% of the time and you only need backup heat on one day, then it
Mm-hmm.
really starts to, you know, make sense. So
Yeah, that's a lot of good information there. And, there are different types of heat pumps. We're seeing domestic hot water, heat pump water heaters, I guess we call them. We do a lot of commercial business too, and those are gaining in popularity. But a few things came to my mind when you were talking, like the history of heat pumps. And a lot of people think this is new technology because they may be hearing about it in their part of the country for the first time. And I actually Google searched like the first heat pump, and it was like some guy in 18, I don't know, 60 or something in Europe was using it to dry out salt marshes for salt or something like that. So the technology's been around for a while, is what I'm trying to say. And even in the commercial and residential business, full steam ahead for since I don't know, since the 70s. So it's been around. The technology today is obviously a lot different. They're a lot more efficient, a lot more reliable. Yeah, and then the other thing that came to mind when you were sharing there was the cost. Like we do hear this too, like the cost of operating a heat pump. We do a lot of stuff on TikTok and LinkedIn and YouTube, and we get all these comments from all over the country and all over the world of, oh, those are too expensive to operate. And I'm like, well, maybe. It
maybe,
depends
yeah.
on what you pay for electricity. It also depends on what you pay for your secondary heat source. And all heat pumps that I know of, except for maybe water cooled or water source, have a backup heater. Like electric strip heat is very common in the extreme south when you don't have a lot of heating days. Gas heat is very common, I'm sure, where you are, where I'm at. It's kind of a mixture. My home unit here has it's a heat pump with electric heat for backup. So let's talk about that, because that is another area which is extremely confusing to a lot of people. Is what is the purpose of the secondary heat in a heat pump?
Yeah, for sure. And the secondary heat is really, like you said, it's going to be climate specific, because we
Mhm.
run into, like, we're based in Denver. We also recently opened a branch in Phoenix, and in Phoenix people don't really have backup heat there. And it's because it never gets below freezing. Like on
Ah,
every heat pump that we've stumbled across. We've only been out there a few months, so if you're in Phoenix and you're saying, "Hey, we have backup heat," don't I've I've
yeah,
been
yeah.
stumbling through a few systems, and we don't see it that often, but that's because it gets down to 40 or 50. If you don't
Mhm.
have heat one night, it's not going to be catastrophic. You're not going to have frozen pipes.
Right,
You can put on a
right.
sweater, you'll be fine, sort of thing. But backup heat, obviously, in Denver, if your heat pump, um, keeps up, because most of the stuff we install a lot of like inverter heat pumps are the most popular because the
Mhm.
COP ratings are very high. Like the COP ratings are such that they're sometimes 3 to 4 times as efficient as their like electric counterparts
For
if you're
sure,
comparing it
yeah.
to electric baseboard heat. And so a lot of the times, these systems, the reason they have backup heat is because the COP gets low once it drops like below 0 degrees or -5 or -10.
Mhm.
It might be the same as running a space heater in terms of its efficiency. And because of that, so we really look at when we're installing a system, we look at like the COP charts and things like that to make sure what we're putting in, we know it's going to work 99% of the time. And then the backup
Mhm.
heat, the purpose of it is just if we're putting in electric heat kit, the reason for that is just when it's -9 out here, you definitely want heat, even though most people have either a gas fireplace or a wood fireplace or a combination of both. And especially as you get into the mountains, a lot of people have like a pellet stove too, because
Mhm.
we deal with like downed power lines and things. Like we live in Conifer, which is about 45 minutes outside of Denver, and our the first week or two we moved in, we had the power go out on our dog sitter when we were out of
Oh,
town,
yeah.
and and she was feeding the fire. That was how. And then the power came back on in 8 hours. But those are you're always going to have some level of backup heat, but the backup heat that you get from heat strips and things like that is just going to be there, so that way you don't have to worry. It's when the system's designed properly, it should only be for the far when it's really not going to keep up, and
That's right.
it's just there because what happens is your capacity reduces in addition, so the heat pump's not even as effective. It might have been a 5 ton or a commercial application much larger, obviously, because you deal with a lot of commercial systems. But if its capacity is down 50%, that electric heat or the furnace heat in the case of dual fuel systems is going to be sized to cover the load on that coldest day.
Mhm.
So it'll be able to keep the house comfortable and at a minimum keep it from like getting to a point where you deal with frozen pipes and things like that.
Yeah, or in your case, frozen people.
Yeah, frozen people.
So if you lose the heat where I'm at and electricity, and you don't have any heat, you can bundle up and survive. It would be painful and cold, but I spent some time in your neck of the woods. I lived in Breckenridge in our
Oh, okay.
RV for 6 months with the family. We kind of, 5 years ago, we sold everything and we bought an RV and were like, hey, let's go to Breckenridge. And we had no idea like what we were getting into with the cold.
Wow.
The first night there, I think our mop like froze to the floor of the RV. That's how cold it was. But we ended up getting through just fine once you Colorado proof your camper. But we had a
For
ton of fun
sure.
there. So yeah, that just was reminding me like in some areas it's more important than others. And just to recap, like if you're listening to this, COP is coefficient of performance. That's kind of our SEER rating for heat pumps, if you will. If you're looking at buying a heat pump, the higher the number, the more efficient it is, the less you're gonna use on the electric grid. And the other thing that came to mind, like we go into defrost mode a lot with heat pumps here in our neck of the woods. And if you're not familiar with heat pump, well, let's talk. Why don't you give a great rundown about how a heat pump works? Why don't you give a general rundown of that real quick, and then we'll talk about the defrost mode too.
Yeah, for sure. So, heat pumps, like for people that have like if you've never heard of a heat pump, or like how you said, a lot of people sometimes think it's new technology. It's actually not just. It's not only not new technology, but it's really just an air conditioner with an added component or a couple components.
Hmm.
You have a reversing valve, and then the electronics are the defrost control board, which basically, when the condenser outside gets too much frost or ice blocking it. It knows that and it goes into defrost mode and basically reverses the flow of refrigerant, does a
Hmm.
defrost, drops all the ice, and then it starts heating again. And so that's the main difference between a heat pump is it's really just an air conditioner, but it has that added a little bit more. If you look inside the air conditioner outside, your that or the
Hmm.
condenser outside on a heat pump, when you compare it to an air conditioner, it's going to have a little bit more copper inside to in layman's terms, to the untrained eye, because you're going to see a reversing valve and a few more refrigerant circuits. But it's essentially the same thing. And then that added defrost control board is just when you pop off the cover on it, you're going to have that added control board that you might not see on like a normal single stage air conditioner. But that's really the only difference between the two.
Yeah. So heat pump mode, heat pump is an air conditioner in reverse, right? In air conditioning, we're taking the heat out of interior zone, whether it's a commercial building or your home, and we're rejecting that heat to the relatively cool atmosphere through the condensing unit. You swap that around in the heat pump mode, and now your outdoor coil becomes your air conditioner, your cold coil, your DX cold coil, right? So you're
Yep.
cooling the air. It could be cooling it from 25 degrees down to 20 degrees. That's how you're taking, so you're taking BTUs out of that air and bringing them and putting them inside as heat. But when you do that, if the dew point's just right outside, you'll start getting frost on the coil because it's very cold. And if the air is at the right conditions, you'll get frost in there. It builds up, clicks in the defrost mode. Now the defrost mode, now you're blowing cold air in your space, which you don't want to do if it's cold,
Yeah.
especially if you have a wife and kids.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
so the backup heat, comes on as, supplemental heat or whatever you want to call it, emergency heat, whatever term you use in your area. But that comes on to temper the cold air during defrost mode, as well as provide you an extra boost if it's too cold outside and you're not getting enough BTUs, or like if a component fails, if your reversing valve fails, if your compressor fails, like we said earlier, then you have that extra heat source to pick up the slack, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah. So how do you when you're talking to clients about dual fuel, do a lot of them have gas where you're at? Do a lot of heat pumps have gas in them as well in your neck of the woods, or?
Yeah. So what we run into the most is, the people that are considering, because a lot of it does come down to, there's a, when people are getting HVAC for their house, it's like there's a perfect world scenario, which means, you manifested the $2 million you just talked about earlier, and you can spend whatever you want,
Right.
right, and get this cool, setup. And then there's the more common scenario, which is like, hey, I'm trying to be practical at the same time getting what I want. That's going to be a combination of what's number one, what's most comfortable. Number two, what's cost effective to run. And so the heat pump scenarios we run into are going to be people that we have a couple of kind. The further you go away from Denver, we have people who are off the grid and they are on propane. And those
Mm,
people, heat pumps start to make a lot of sense because propane,
very
like
expensive. Yeah.
very expensive. When we first moved into our house, it was on propane and there was actually gas in the neighborhood. So we bit the bullet and just paid to have a gas line ran because the break even was like a no brainer. But it
Right.
was something
Yeah.
where we set it like we normally would when we lived in the city. And, we got a bill for like $800 to heat that month. And and this is, I don't live in a mansion, just I live, it's like 2,000
Hmm.
square feet. So for a
Right.
small house, you're talking a massive propane bill. Whereas on a heat pump, you could heat that space for,
Right.
maybe $150, $200 at our current rate, we're paying about, I think 12, 13 cents a kilowatt hour. And so the people that it makes the most sense for is people that are on propane. And even in that application, the reason dual fuel works well is because if someone's on propane, that propane tank, they might have a 500 or 1,000 gallon tank, and then when they put in a
Hmm.
dual fuel application, suddenly they don't have to they refill their propane tank every few years,
Oh my
and
gosh. Yeah.
instead, maybe every 5 years or something, because that furnace is only going to be kicking on one night out of the year, 2 nights out of the year, depending on what the climate is. And it's also, comes down to like how well your house is insulated and things like that. Cause that's what
Hmm.
we try to have like a holistic approach when we're looking at it, because it's, like basic thermodynamics, heat transfers from, hot to cold. And so we're always like, how do we keep the heat in? It's just, separate it from the cold as best you can. So the dual fuel application is really popular here because for a lot of people, because they already have that existing infrastructure, it becomes almost a wash from a price point perspective. Because if you're adding electric heat, what a lot of people don't realize about resistive heat, and I mean a lot of people, HVAC guys know this, right? That's but
Hmm.
the layman or the person who's shopping for an organization or for their home, is that resistive heat that's the baseline of COP, or coefficient of performance. So it's 1 watt of electricity to 1 watt in terms of BTUs,
Hmm.
heat. And so it's just a 1-to-1 ratio. That's kind of the baseline. Number one, it's very expensive, but number two, in order to get that heat output, you need a massive electrical circuit. So like a backup, like a 15
Mm,
kilowatt backup heater, which is about 60,000 BTUs. It's lossless heat, so there's no efficiency loss through the combustion process like you would have with a furnace where you have an input and an output. And
mhm.
we talk about that on our channel when we're like educating homeowners on what efficiency ratings actually mean. But a 15 kilowatt heat strip kit could need you know 0 gauge or 2 gauge wire ran to a 100 amp breaker or an 80 amp breaker or something, or it could require multiple breakers. And then once you get into a 20 or 25 kilowatt heat strip kit, it can get, you're talking, you almost need a second panel for the one night out of the year that you're going to run a
Right.
resistive heat. And so in a cold climate, that's especially in a moderate cold climate like Colorado, where people already have a furnace, it's very easy for us to just put in a furnace, pair it with a dual fuel heat pump.
No
And
brainer.
yeah, it's a no-brainer. And then there's no draw on the grid. And then the only time that furnace really runs is, like I said, those 1 or 2 cold nights where your heat pump isn't keeping up. Because the way that we actually set it up, because the defrost cycle you mentioned, um, it is true. It's something that people run into, but we don't typically set up the equipment so that it's blowing air during that defrost cycle, just because we found like we just tell people, hey, it's gonna cycle a little bit more and it ramps
Mhm.
up and down. So if you're comfortable and it's keeping up, just because it says 70 on the thermostat or it's set at 70 but it's only 69, like, don't panic. I promise it's running in the most efficient way possible.
Mhm.
Because in actuality, especially for someone on propane, like, we don't really necessarily want the furnace to kick on unless we know there's an absolute cutoff. And so you can set it so that, hey, at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees or however the heat pump was kind of sized for the heating load, because you also have to account for more airflow with a heat pump versus a furnace, in terms of sizing and how many BTUs you can pack in the airflow. And so, or in the airstream. And so we might set it to, okay, at 10, switch out of heat pump mode, don't even bother, just stick with the furnaces and or for heating. And then once it gets above, 15 or whatever that threshold is, then it'll kick back into normal heat pump mode. And that seems to work really well for,
Nice.
our customers out here. So
Yeah, that's nice that you have the capability to do that in a standard system. That's great. Yeah, when
yeah.
you're talking about like the COP, so COP of one is electric strip heat. It always confuses me. I'm like, well, how could a COP of a heat pump be 3? They're both using electricity to make heat. And someone explained to me a long time ago, said, well, with electric heat, you're creating heat. With a heat pump, you're moving heat. Like you're moving
Hmm.
heat from one area to another. So that's why it can be more efficient. And the other thing like was coming to my mind. So if you're watching, and I'm sure you've heard of electrification and decarbonization movements in the world, which is like moving from gas heated products, whether it's a gas boiler, a gas water heater, a gas air conditioner, gas heating in your air conditioning unit to electric. And we're starting to see that more and more in our area. And one of the biggest challenges is if you have an existing facility, I'm talking like a commercial type facility, and it has a 40-ton, what we call in our area, a gas pack. That means it's a package unit with gas burner in it, and your company is driven to get away from gas for whatever reason, and you change that to a heat pump with electric heat. You have to be really careful, and you kind of touched on this with the electrical sizing, right? Because the electric strip heater, at least in our neck of the woods, is going to operate in conjunction with your compressors. So, whereas before you had your load is basically primarily sized by your compressors, now it's sized by the compressors and electric strip heat running at the same time, which could be pretty substantial if you've got a 40, 50, 80-ton package unit. So, I always caution people, I'm like, slow down when you're looking at doing this, to upgrade your panels going to be, that's a different an additional cost than just swapping it out for like to like. So I don't know if you see anything like that in your market, but
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's funny too with like the thing with panels is I don't know if it's gotten better, because the last time I had to get a substantial panel was a couple years ago, but we were waiting over a year for a 100 amp service
oh
or a
my
400
gosh.
amp service to come in, because we had a 400 amp
Mm,
3-phase switch gear and it was on back. I said, how long would this have normally taken? He said, yeah, about 8 weeks. And it was over a year from the time we paid for it till
Oh
the
my
time we
gosh.
got it. And so yeah, you want to be you want to be aware of
Yeah.
that. And thinking, some of the supply chain stuff has gotten better because we don't have really that many supply chain issues anymore, but I don't know what's going on in the electric space. Last I heard,
Hmm.
my electrician was saying it was still kind of difficult. He retired last year, so we have a new electrician. So if that's any indication,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
is. But
Yeah, and this conversation reminds me of the classic engineering contracting answer when we're asked a question, it depends. Let me ask you 15 more questions and I'll give you the because you just don't know. Like it depends. Like is a heat pump with electric heat better than a gas pack unit for my well, it depends. Let's talk about this, let's talk about that, let's talk about
yeah,
this. And there's no like silver bullet solution for any issue, whether it's efficiency or first cost or anything. There's always these engineering and installation trade-offs between A, B, and C. And it's nice to find someone who knows that difference and work with them. And it sounds like you're one of those guys. So anything else regarding heat pumps you want to cover, Howard, or what do you think?
yeah, no, I mean, I think we touched on most of it. I'm excited to see some of the other technology, that's coming out. Like I mentioned
Hmm.
earlier, like some of the, I think that's going to be the biggest difference when you see a lot of these air to water products come into the space, because one of the things they have is they have like a buffer tank where you have a holding tank of water
Hmm.
that heats from resistive heat as well as a backup. And they also have,
Mm.
same thing. It's like a dual fuel where they have a backup. It's a natural gas water heater, but it's also a sidearm or like an indirect fired water heater like you'd have in a hydronics loop. And then now you have a heat pump, so if you only have one cold day, there might be enough heat stored in that tank from the day before. So I think it's going to be really interesting, like the stuff that you see coming out. But no, I mean, we covered a lot of topics, and I thought that was great. So
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you came on and let's definitely do this again. And why don't you tell people, if they're in your area, how to find you for service and talk a little bit about your YouTube channel.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. So we're based in Denver Metro, and we service a pretty wide service area inside of Denver. We also have a location in Phoenix, and we have plans to expand to 3 markets in Texas next year or the year after. We're aiming for next year, but we'll see how soon we can kind of stabilize Phoenix. But so you can get in touch with us online. You can check out our YouTube show, the HVAC Dope Show, which is more geared towards a lot of like residential content. But if you're in the market for new HVAC and you had no idea kind of where to start, we try to gear it in a way to where we do get technical and we break down how things work and what type of equipment is out on the market and what's coming to market, and we dispel common myths like some of the cold weather heat pump myths and things like that, and really try to give people a way that they can stay informed on how they can get the best HVAC for their home and see what's out there. Because the truth is, like on this topic, a heat pump might not make sense for everyone, and especially like if you're just trying to heat a condo and there's like it's a retrofit application and it might be difficult. That's going to be a much different conversation where a lot of times you probably put in what's existing, versus if it's like your forever home and you've got solar and you own the land and you have mineral rights and you can drill. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do. So we try to put out content related to every question that people have. So yeah, you can check us out at the HVAC Dope Show. And thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, please go check it out. You do a great job on your channel. And thank you so much, Howard. We appreciate you. And thank you for listening to the Engineers HVAC podcast. And we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks.
Sounds good. Likewise.